Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. This week's one is a little bit different. It's not necessarily a mystery, but it's not necessarily a solved case either because there's not really anything to solve. It's just an interesting case. This story is about the Eriksson twins. Now the Eriksson twins consisted of Sabina and Ursula Eriksson. They were identical and they were born in Sweden on the 3rd of November 1967. And very little is actually known about their backgrounds, about their childhood. From what I can gather, I think they had a fairly normal childhood and upbringing. Importantly, it doesn't seem like they had any previous mental health issues or criminal convictions at all. I did see one source that said they had a previous issue with crystal meth, but there was literally nothing to back this up, so I'm going to say that's probably not true. But as children, the twins were incredibly close, as a lot of twins usually are. And this made a lot of the other children think they were a little bit odd, they were a little bit bullied, but other than that, their childhood was pretty normal. But as close as they were as children, by the year 2000, they were actually living apart in different countries. Ursula lived in the USA and Sabina lived in Ireland in County Cork with her husband and their 2 children. Now, due to the lack of information about their past, I can't tell you how close the twins were whilst they're living in different countries or even how often they spoke. But what I can tell you is that at one point Sabina's son actually went over to live with Ursula in the USA, so I can assume that their families were pretty close. And in May 2008, Ursula actually flies over to Ireland to visit Sabina. Now at this time they're both 41 years old, and things take a little bit of a strange turn, and nobody's really been able to pinpoint the exact moment at which things started to get a little bit odd. But it's thought that Sabina had an argument with her partner at one point, and so Sabina and Ursula leave Sabina's house in the middle of the night and don't tell anyone where they're going. This is on Friday, May 16th, 2008. The two leave the house and they catch a ferry across to Liverpool in England, and once they get there they head straight to St Anne's Street police station. Once they're at the police station, they tell the officers that they're concerned about the safety of Sabina's children, who they'd left back in Ireland with Sabina's partner. And the authorities obviously have to do something. They reach out to the Dublin police, and the Dublin police go to Sabina's house and they find absolutely nothing strange. Everyone's happy. I don't know how old her children were, but I think they're probably a little bit older, so able to tell them, like, no, we're fine, there's nothing wrong. They were just very confused about where their mother had gone. If Sabina and Ursula did genuinely think that the children were in danger, why would they catch a ferry across to Liverpool to go to the police there instead of just calling up the police in Dublin? By 11:30 AM that morning, Sabina and Ursula had boarded a National Express coach from Liverpool headed to London. Now eventually the coach has to stop at a service station, at Keele service station on the M6 in North Staffordshire, to refuel basically. And the two are displaying some very odd behaviour on the coach. They're acting really strange, so much so that other people and the driver are beginning to notice. Before they even boarded the bus, they refused to let the driver search their bags, and the driver asked to search their bags because they were acting very weird about them. They were holding them really close to their chest, like hugging them to their chest, as if their entire life depended on it. There are conflicting reports of exactly what happened once they reached this service station. Some reports say that they fell ill, so they disembarked the coach themselves. Others say that the driver forcibly removed them from the coach because they were acting so weird and they were just weirding all the other passengers out. I do personally think that it's most likely the second option, that the driver removed them, because that's what it says in the documentary, which I think is called Madness in the Fast Lane. It'll be linked down below. Really worth a watch. So the driver basically gets the twins off the coach and goes up to the service station manager and basically says to her, they're your problem now, you deal with them, I'm getting out of here. So he drives away with the coach, and so now it's up to the service manager to figure out what the hell is going on. And she just watches the twins from afar, just keeps an eye on them, and they're acting really weird. They're sort of whispering to each other, having some sort of conversation about something. They're looking around, acting all suspicious, and they're still clutching their bags to their chest. And she actually starts to worry that there's a bomb in one of the bags or in both the bags. That's how oddly these twins were acting. So she makes the decision to call the police, and the police arrive and they question the twins and find nothing out of the ordinary at all. They actually give the twins a phone number for the coach company, tell them to call the number and find out when the next coach is coming through that station to London, and then the police just go on their way. But nobody could have guessed what was going to happen next. Ursula and Sabina walk out of the service station and they actually cross onto the central reservation of the M6 motorway, and they just start walking along the central reservation. Now of course the motorway has cameras positioned all down it, and the cameras are watched by people at the highway agency whose entire job basically is to make sure that the motorways are safe. If there's any sort of crashes and stuff, they see it immediately on these cameras and send people out to help. So these people at the highway agency are watching the cameras and they see these two women walking down the middle of the motorway. And of course they're not allowed to do that, so immediately the highway agency send out some patrol cars to talk to the women and basically get them off. But this makes everything worse because they sort of start to freak out a little bit. And one of the twins just runs out onto the road into the fast lane, and the highway patrol aren't police. They have no actual jurisdiction. They're just there to try and keep people safe when they can. So they call the police, the real police, for backup. Now in a strange twist, quite a helpful coincidence, the police officers that responded to the call that day actually had a film crew in tow, and the film crew actually filming for a TV show called Motorway Cops. They were PC Tracy Cope and PC Paul Finlayson, and just weirdly everything that happened after they were called to the scene was captured on camera. So everything I'm about to tell you, there's footage of it. So the PCs arrive hearing there are people running into the motorway, and they expected to arrive to some pretty severe injuries, but they arrive and there's nothing really wrong. Ursula and Sabina are now stood on the hard shoulder of the motorway with the highway patrol officers, and they're just both totally fine. They're just chatting, stood there, don't really look like they're causing any trouble. So the police go up to the patrol officers and start to talk to them to find out the full story, what's gone on. But whilst they're doing so, one of the twins, Ursula, actually starts to run back into the road. Now PC Finlayson tries to stop her, he grabs her jacket, but she simply just slips out of it and carries on running. And she just runs straight into the path of an articulated lorry that's travelling about 56 miles per hour, and she goes under both the front wheels. And Sabina very quickly follows suit. She runs into the road as well and gets hit head on by a Volkswagen Polo and is thrown up into the air. But as if by miracle, both sisters somehow manage to survive this. Sabina spends about 15 minutes unconscious lying on the ground, but shows very, very little injury other than this. Amazing considering she was actually thrown into the air. Ursula, however, had some more severe injuries. Both of her legs were crushed by the lorry. She had compound fractures, and the officer literally said it looked like her legs had exploded. Now with both of the twins now lying in the middle of the motorway, the highway agency begins to close off the roads and cars begin to slow to a halt. And honestly, it's just really lucky that there weren't any other accidents. And although she's completely immobilised at this point, Ursula is lying on the ground, both of her legs crushed. She's trying her hardest to escape. She tells the policeman who stood with her, "I recognise you. I know you're not real." She just seems completely out of it. She's spitting, scratching, screaming at him. She's calling for the police, but doesn't really seem to understand that the police are the ones who are with her. And it's around this time that Sabina gains consciousness finally, and she starts screaming herself, again screaming and calling for the police. And she is screaming, "They're trying to steal your organ." The officers are desperately trying to keep her on the ground, one to restrain her, but two because there's a big chance that she had a pretty serious head injury and they didn't want to cause her any more harm. But Sabina's really fighting against them. She eventually gets up and she actually ends up punching PC Cope. And she just runs. She runs over the central reservation and into the other side of the road. And again, luckily, she doesn't get hit. The officers run after her and they attempt to restrain her, but it proves impossible. She's almost got this superhuman strength, and she's fighting all of these people off. They cannot control her until members of the public literally have to stop at the side of the road on the motorway and assist. And eventually it takes 6 full-grown adults to hold her to stop her moving. The officers at the scene assume that drugs have to be involved, that these people have to be high on something. It's either that or a suicide pact. It's so strange for both of them to be acting in the exact same way. At this point, the emergency services have arrived on the scene and they actually refuse to treat Sabina because she's being so violent, even at this point with her handcuffs on. So they have to make the decision to sedate her. She's taken to hospital where she seems to calm down quite a lot. Obviously, she's under sedation. And she has this strange lack of concern over her sister. Her sister's very severely injured. She's had to be airlifted to hospital. Her legs are completely crushed. but Sabina doesn't really seem to ask about her at any point. This is where the story here with Ursula kind of ends. Ursula remains in a critical condition in hospital for quite a while, but she eventually recovers and she leaves hospital around September 2008, and from what I can gather, she moved back to Sweden after this. Still at the scene, the police have a look through the twins' bags and they find the clothes, they find a few different phones, and they find just one passport, one ID, which tells them that they were 41 years old and Swedish. And it's also through this that they learn that the girls are identical twins. Sabina was released from hospital just 5 hours after she was admitted. Amazingly, she had no severe injuries whatsoever. And when she leaves hospital, she's taken immediately into police custody. But by this point, she's so calm, she's so chilled, like so opposite of what she was on the motorway, that the police don't even feel like they need to put handcuffs on her to put her in the back of the police car. This woman, who had literally a few hours before been fighting off police officers, was now just laughing and chatting with them. While she's being processed at the station, Sabina seems more than happy. She's even having a harmless flirt with the officer who's processing her. They ask her to remove her clothes and she's remarking like, oh, they're so dirty and they're so smelly. And she also makes a very strange comment. Like, it doesn't seem creepy at the time she says it, but it's almost foreboding. She says, we say in Sweden that an accident rarely comes alone. Usually at least one more follows, or two. At the time, just an odd comment to make, but looking at what happens next, it's just very, very foreboding. And something else officers find very strange is she's still not asked anything about her sister at all. They actually call Sabina's partner back in Ireland to like tell him what's going on, and he says to them like he's just very confused about what's going on. He has no idea what caused her to run away, but he said later to the police that shortly before they disappeared, Sabina and Ursula literally became inseparable. They would not do anything without each other. Sabina is charged with assaulting a police officer and trespassing on the motorway, whilst her sister, still in a critical condition in hospital, isn't charged with anything. Sabina appears in court a couple of days later on the 19th of May 2008, and honestly I couldn't find out at all what she was doing in those couple of days, but she pleads guilty to both charges. The court sentences her to 1 full day in custody, which she was deemed to have already served, having spent a full night in police custody, and she's allowed to go. Nor at any point in all of this was Sabina ever given a psychiatric evaluation, or did she have her blood taken for any sort of blood test whatsoever. She seemed totally calm by the time she arrived at hospital. Of course, she was under sedation, but the doctors had no grounds to force a psychiatric evaluation whatsoever. Ursula, however, did have her bloods taken while she was in hospital, and they found nothing in her bloodstream. No mind-altering substances, no alcohol, like literally nothing like that whatsoever. And the two were doing exactly the same things, acting exactly the same way, and I feel pretty confident in saying that if Ursula didn't have anything in her bloodstream, Sabina probably wouldn't have done either. So after leaving court, Sabina starts to wander around the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, and she had nowhere in particular to go. She's carrying all of her possessions in this clear plastic bag given to her by the police. She's now wearing her sister's green top. Apparently at this point she's trying to locate her sister in hospital, but she doesn't seem to be like walking with any kind of purpose. Around 7 PM, Sabina's walking around the streets and shouts over to 2 men on the opposite side of the road that she liked their dog. And these men were 54-year-old Glenn Hollinshead and his friend Peter Malloy. And the two decide to approach Sabina with their dog. And Sabina seems very like lost and confused, and they strike up a conversation. Sabina's stroking the dog and she tells them that she's trying to find her sister in hospital and that she needs to find a bed and breakfast or hotel to stay in for the night. Now this was a very residential area, and Glenn and Peter reply saying like she's not going to find anything like that around here. But why doesn't she come back to Glenn's house for a little bit? She can have something to drink, something to eat, and they can try and find out what hospital her sister's at. And apparently this was very typical of Glenn. He was a good Samaritan who was always willing to help out people in need. He was a really rare person like that. And he didn't think anything of offering to help Sabina whatsoever. He was a self-employed welder, he was a fully qualified paramedic, and he was a former RAF airman. So possibly all of his previous life experience just lent to him always wanting to give a helping hand when he could. So back at the house, the three have a drink and they have some cigarettes, and Sabina starts to act a little bit oddly again. Peter asks about her sister, sort of says like what happened, and immediately Sabina goes cold. She refuses to say anything, give anything away, and she seems paranoid as well. Apparently they'd be sitting at the table having a chat, and Sabina would just get up and like look outside the window, and she'd like look around, and then she'd close the blind, sit back down, like she was worried somebody was following her. At one point she offers the men some cigarettes from her own carton, and they accept, they put them in their mouths, go to light them up, and then Sabina just snatches them off them and says, you can't have them, they might be poisoned. And Peter said he found this particularly weird because Sabina had been smoking out of that same pack of cigarettes all night. It's around this point that Peter says he starts to feel very uncomfortable, like this woman is obviously very odd, but around this point, like, she's acting so strangely that he just kind of wants to get out of that situation entirely. But Glenn doesn't bat an eyelid. Shortly before midnight, Peter leaves and Sabina actually stays the night at Glenn's house, seeing as there were no B&Bs nearby whatsoever. And the next day around midday, Sabina's still there and Glenn actually calls his brother Paul, who worked at the local hospital, and sort of tells Paul what's going on, says that they're looking for Sabina's sister. Can Paul find out anything? I'm not sure what Paul said. He probably said like, yeah, sure, I'll get back to you. And so Sabina stays with Glenn. About 7:40 p.m. that night, Glenn pops out the back of his house and speaks to his neighbour, Frank Booth. Now Frank was also at the back of his house washing down his minibus. And Glenn basically asks Frank if he has any tea bags he can borrow. He's run out, and Frank says, yeah, sure, let me just finish up what I'm doing. I'll run in and grab you some. So Glenn heads back inside. Just 1 minute later, Glenn comes staggering back out of his house, now bleeding from his abdomen. He's been stabbed 4 times, once directly in the heart. He tells Frank, she stabbed me, and says that he's dying, and basically his final words were to ask Frank to look after his dog. He then collapses to the ground and dies very quickly. As Frank's dialing 999 for help, Sabina flees Glenn's house. She's clearly disorientated, she's in a really poor mental state, and she's running, basically smashing herself in the head with this hammer. And a passing motorist, a man called Joshua Grattage, actually sees Sabina in the street hitting herself in the head with this hammer and decides to pull over to help. So he like lunges at her and grabs the hammer, just trying to like lure it away. And she really puts up a fight, like she's fighting with him. And he feels himself get hit in the back of the head at one point with what he assumed to be her fist. He later found out there was actually a broken piece of roof tile that she'd pulled out of her pocket. This is enough to like break his grip on her, and so he lets go and she just runs. By this point, paramedics turn up and they're like following her, trying to help. She runs towards the bridge at Heron's Cross and jumps off the bridge, is 40 foot high, directly onto the A50. Once again, straight into oncoming traffic, and somehow she again manages to survive. This time though, she has 2 broken ankles and has fractured her skull. Obviously she's rushed to hospital and she's arrested a little while later once she's recovered on June 6th, 2008. She spends quite a few months recovering in hospital, and on September 11th, 2008, she's discharged from hospital. She's immediately once again taken to the police station where she's officially charged with murder. Obviously she's questioned by the police multiple times over the coming months, and for every single question all she had to say was no comment. So to this day we still have no answer from Sabina or Ursula as to what exactly happened. They've always refused to say anything. After some complications, the trial is finally set to start on the 1st of September 2009, so well after a year after everything that happened. In the time before the trial, she's assessed by 2 separate forensic psychologists, once for the defence and once for the prosecution. And they both agree that in May 2008 she was seriously mentally ill, and both sides declared that she was actually like insane at the time of the killing, although she had become totally sane again by the time the trial started. It was a really difficult trial for the judge because she was insane and now she's not. How much culpability does she really hold here, and is she a threat to the public anymore? They were the 2 main questions that the judge had to ask himself here. The defence claimed that Sabina was the secondary sufferer of folie à deux, or madness of 2, influenced by the presence of her twin sister. Now I mentioned this phenomenon in my Jameson family video, and I said in that I had another video talking about this particular phenomenon coming up very soon, and this is it. It can sometimes also be referred to as shared psychotic disorder or induced delusional disorder, and identical twins in particular have very, very close relationships. Usually, not always obviously, but occasionally they're so close that there sort of becomes a blurred boundary between who exactly is who. Their mental states are so intertwined that they're basically the same person. There's a lot of really interesting research out there about identical twins, about the possible mental links they may have, especially when they're raised to be close. Like there's even examples of identical twins who are split up at birth and then they meet 20, 30 years later and they're still exactly the same in every way, including mental illnesses, the way they think, like particular little things they do. A lot of scientists think that some identical twins just have this extra psychological bond. Perhaps you could even go as far as to say telepathic, maybe that's a little bit like OTT, but you're thinking along those lines. And it's something that fraternal twins, regular siblings, don't really have. I know I'll probably get some people down below like, I'm an identical twin and that's all rubbish, I don't have that. I know I have identical twins in my family and they're not exactly like that either, but it is something that does exist. You can't deny that. But the genetic identicalness means that if there is some sort of genetic predisposition to mental illness, that they would both have this exact same predisposition, meaning that they're possibly egged on, for want of a better word, by the other. When one of them starts to get in a bad mental state, the other would do as well. Possibly because if you've been raised as very close identical twins, that you always believe that you have to be exactly the same as the other, or potentially it's just this psychological link. Basically, in a nutshell, what the defence was arguing was that Ursula had this mental condition. Obviously, the twins didn't live in the same country, they didn't see each other all the time. When Ursula travels over to Ireland and meets Sabina, Sabina begins to sort of like feed off this, and she believes that she has to act the same way that Ursula is as well, because they're identical twins and they have to be identical. That is part of their identity. But by no means is it a conscious thing at all. This isn't Sabina deciding to do this, this is just something that is happening. There's something really dangerous about two people in psychotic states feeding off each other, because they sort of validate the other's delusions. So if Sabina potentially goes to Ursula and says like, I've just had a big argument with my partner, Ursula's there like, yeah, your children could be in danger. Sabina's like, yeah, I agree, they're definitely in danger, we need to do something about it. And they're sort of like feeding off each other and sort of pushing each other's delusions further. Obviously I'm not a psychologist, this isn't something that I've studied loads, but I was reading a lot of articles on this whilst I was researching for this case because it is so interesting, and I'm definitely open to conversation about it down below as well. I'm just talking about it in terms of like what I've read and what I find interesting here. So the court hear that Sabina suffers with a rare psychiatric disorder which makes her hear voices, as well as her potentially suffering as well from delusional disorder. Delusional disorder is a disorder where the patient presents delusional thoughts without having any of the other usual symptoms that accompany like mental illness. A lot of people also speculate that both the twins suffered from schizophrenia as well, which is known to run in families. But the weirdest thing here is the twins were always fine. They never had any mental illness, nothing was ever wrong until May 2008. And they had this like burst, this puff of madness, and then they were fine again, then they were completely sane once again. Sabina pleads not guilty, which is accepted by the prosecution. The judge concludes that Sabina has a low level of culpability for her actions, and I'm going to read to you the exact quote he said in court. I understand that this sentence will seem entirely inadequate to the relatives of the deceased. However, I have sentenced on the basis that the reason for the killing was a mental illness, and therefore the culpability of the defendant is low, and therefore the sentence I have passed is designed to protect the public. It is not designed to reflect the grief the relatives have suffered or to measure the value of Mr. Hollinhead's life. No sentence that I could pass could do that. It is a sentence which I hope fairly measures a truly tragic event. She was suffering from delusions that she believed to be true and they dictated her behaviour. It is not one of those cases where the defendant could have done something to avoid the onset. So basically what he's saying is that Sabina had no say in her mental state, like it was a mental illness, it was delusional, it happened to her. But now she's sane again, she isn't a risk to the public at all. He would be quite happy to let her out on the street and he would be confident that she wouldn't hurt anyone again. It was just a puff of madness. Sabina is sentenced to 5 years in prison, which is a pretty measly sentence for murder. However, she's actually released in 2011, so just 2 years later, due to good behaviour and the fact that she'd already spent 400 and something days in custody before her trial as well. The judge did have another potential option, which would be to sentence her to prison with no set release date, just when she's deemed to no longer be a threat to the public. However, the nature of her illness, like I said, was that she wasn't any longer a risk to the public. She was mad for a little bit and now she's not. And it's for this exact same reason as well that she couldn't be sentenced to time in a mental hospital, because by the time her trial came round, she was sane again. At the end of the day, a man needlessly died. It was a death that should have and could have been avoided entirely. Glenn was simply being a good Samaritan, trying to help somebody in need, and it came back to stab him in the back, no pun intended. Sabina should have been properly mentally assessed after what happened on the motorway, either in hospital or in police custody. Both her and Glenn were failed by the authorities. I mean, it was very obvious that she was either very mentally ill to do what she did, or she was on drugs, or that she was suicidal, all of which should have been investigated more, and they weren't. Today, Sabina's whereabouts are kind of unknown. She's thought to be back in Scandinavia somewhere, but what we do know is that she hasn't reoffended since 2011, so this literally was just a moment of madness. I'll be interested to see if she ever actually speaks out about the events of May 2008. I would love to have an insight into either her or Ursula's mindset at that moment in time. I think this video is going to incite some really interesting discussions down below, so if you have any thoughts and feelings about this, then please make sure you stick them in the comments. I can't wait to read it. Make sure you subscribe to my channel and also check out my pins, my pin store, and my Patreon down below as well. YouTube's getting to the point now where pretty much every true crime video is getting instantly demonetized, and I'm making very little money, so the people buying my pins and supporting me on Patreon are kind of keeping me afloat at this point. So if that is you guys, thank you so much. If not and you want to consider having a look, then the links are down there. No pressure, just letting you know. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.